They threatened him with dues and fines, certain they had the power. But the HOA never saw the twist. He owned the bank holding every one of their mortgages. The crisp autumn morning started like any other until I found a bright yellow foreclosure notice taped to my front door. My coffee mug nearly slipped from my hands as I read the bold letters declaring my house would be seized in 30 days for unpaid HOA dues. The irony hit me like a freight train. Here I was, staring at a foreclosure notice on a property I owned outright, signed by someone who had no idea they were about to poke the sleeping giant of the financial world. Kenneth Morrison, our self-appointed HOA president, had finally crossed the line I never thought anyone would be foolish enough to cross. For months, he'd been escalating his petty power plays, but this fabricated foreclosure notice was his masterpiece of stupidity. As I stood there in my perfectly manicured front yard, the same yard he'd been fining me for imaginary violations, I couldn't help but smile at the beautiful irony unfolding before me. You see, Kenneth had no idea who he was dealing with. To him, I was just another homeowner to bully into submission, another source of revenue for his growing list of ridiculous fines and fees. He saw a quiet guy who kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and never caused trouble. What he didn't see was the truth that would soon turn his entire world upside down. The morning sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as I carefully photographed the fraudulent document. Each click of my phone's camera was capturing evidence that would soon unravel Kenneth's entire scheme. The neighbors were starting their daily routines, completely unaware that their HOA president had just signed his own financial death warrant. Kenneth Morrison thought he held all the power in Willowbrook Estates. He thought his position as HOA president made him untouchable, that his carefully crafted web of fees and fines would continue generating revenue indefinitely. He had no idea that the quiet man he'd been targeting for months wasn't just another homeowner. I was the executive vice president of First National Bank, the very institution that held the mortgages on over 60% of the homes in our neighborhood. As I folded the foreclosure notice and slipped it into my briefcase, I felt a familiar calm wash over me. This wasn't anger. This was the same calculating focus I brought to million-dollar business deals. Kenneth had just handed me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what happens when small-minded bullies mistake patience for weakness. The irony was delicious. Kenneth spent his days dreaming up new ways to extract money from his neighbors, never realizing he was targeting someone who could foreclose on his own house with a simple phone call. But I wasn't interested in petty revenge. I had something much more elegant in mind. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were above the law? Let me tell you how this particular David and Goliath story played out. Except in this version, David had access to Goliath's financial records and the power to pull every string that mattered. Kenneth Morrison was about to learn that some battles aren't worth picking, especially when you don't know who you're fighting. Kenneth Morrison ruled Willowbrook Estates like his own personal kingdom, and every resident was a subject to be controlled, taxed, and intimidated into submission. Standing barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, but wielding his clipboard like a scepter, Kenneth had transformed our once peaceful neighborhood into a bureaucratic nightmare where residents lived in constant fear of his next arbitrary rule or outrageous fine. His reign of terror began innocuously enough 3 years ago when he volunteered to be HOA president after the previous president moved away. What started as enthusiasm for community improvement quickly morphed into an obsession with control that bordered on the pathological. Kenneth didn't just enforce existing rules. He created new ones weekly, each more ridiculous than the last, all designed to generate revenue and assert his dominance. The man had turned home ownership into a minefield of violations. Grass too long by half an inch? That's a $50 fine. Christmas lights still up on January 2nd? Another $100. Car parked in your own driveway for more than 24 hours? Kenneth had somehow made that a violation too, complete with a $75 penalty and a threat of towing at the owner's expense. Kenneth's favorite tactic was the surprise inspection, where he'd prowl the neighborhood with his measuring tape and magnifying glass, searching for any microscopic infraction he could monetize. He'd document everything with his expensive camera, complete with timestamps and GPS coordinates, building cases against neighbors like he was preparing for federal court rather than a neighborhood dispute. What made Kenneth particularly dangerous was his intelligence, combined with his complete lack of moral boundaries. He'd researched every loophole in HOA law, every technicality that could be exploited to increase his power and the association's revenue. He knew exactly how far he could push before crossing into illegal territory, and he danced on that line with the precision of a legal scholar and the ethics of a con artist. The psychological warfare was Kenneth's specialty. He'd schedule mandatory HOA meetings at inconvenient times, knowing most residents couldn't attend, then pass sweeping new regulations with whatever quorum he could manipulate. He'd send certified letters for minor violations, making residents waste time and money signing for documents that contained threats over issues like mailbox height variations of 2 inches. His network of informants throughout the neighborhood fed him a constant stream of intelligence about residents' activities. Kenneth had somehow convinced certain neighbors to report on their friends and neighbors, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that turned Willowbrook Estates into a suburban police state where everyone watched everyone else. Kenneth's power trips extended beyond simple rule enforcement into personal vendetta territory. If someone challenged him at a meeting or questioned his authority, they'd suddenly find themselves buried under an avalanche of violation notices. Coincidentally, their trash cans would be measured daily, their landscaping scrutinized weekly, and their every move monitored until they either moved away or submitted completely to his authority. The man had no concept of proportionality or fairness. A widow struggling with medical bills received the same aggressive collection tactics as wealthy retirees. Kenneth's files contained detailed financial information about every resident, which he used to calibrate his harassment, pushing hardest against those he perceived as most vulnerable while treading more carefully around those with obvious resources or connections. What truly made Kenneth dangerous was his absolute conviction that he was right, that his tyrannical approach was necessary for maintaining property values and neighborhood standards. He'd rationalized his behavior so completely that he genuinely believed his victims deserved their punishment, that anyone who challenged his authority was attacking the very foundation of civilized suburban living. His office, the spare bedroom he'd converted into HOA headquarters, looked like a war room with detailed maps of the neighborhood, filing cabinets full of violation records, and multiple computer monitors displaying surveillance footage from cameras he'd somehow convinced the association to install at key intersections. Kenneth had created a surveillance state that would make authoritarian governments proud. The final ingredient in Kenneth's toxic recipe was his complete underestimation of his neighbors' capabilities and connections. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that quiet, compliant residents might have resources and expertise that could challenge his authority. He assumed that anyone who didn't fight back immediately was weak, powerless, or too intimidated to pose a threat. Kenneth Morrison had spent 3 years building his empire of intimidation, never realizing he was constructing his own prison. His meticulous documentation, his aggressive tactics, and his complete disregard for fairness had created a paper trail that would soon become evidence in his own destruction. The man who thought he was untouchable was about to discover that some neighbors bite back harder than others. The foreclosure notice was just the beginning of Kenneth's most audacious scheme yet. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched in fascination as he systematically escalated his illegal activities, apparently convinced that his previous success in intimidating neighbors had made him invincible. What Kenneth didn't realize was that each new violation he committed was being carefully documented by someone who understood exactly how devastating this evidence would become. Kenneth's master plan involved fabricating a massive backlog of unpaid dues and penalties from multiple residents, complete with forged legal documents that claimed the HOA had the authority to initiate foreclosure proceedings. He'd somehow convinced himself that if he could force several families out of their homes, he could resell the properties through the association and pocket the profits through a complex scheme involving shell companies and kickbacks. The forgery operation was impressively elaborate for someone with no legal training. Kenneth had created an entire fake legal framework, complete with letterhead from non-existent law firms, fictitious court orders, and manufactured debt collection notices. He'd even gone so far as to register several business entities that existed solely on paper, designed to make his scheme appear legitimate to anyone who didn't dig too deep into the documentation. His confidence had grown so astronomical that he started making mistakes that would have been obvious to anyone thinking clearly. Kenneth began demanding immediate payment of fabricated fees from residents he'd targeted for removal, threatening legal action that he had no authority to pursue. He'd moved beyond simple HOA overreach into full-scale financial fraud, apparently believing his position as president provided immunity from consequences. The psychological manipulation reached new heights as Kenneth began spreading rumors about targeted residents, trying to turn neighbors against each other while positioning himself as the only thing standing between the community and complete chaos. He'd weaponized the neighborhood's social dynamics, convincing some residents that aggressive enforcement was necessary to protect their property values from the problem families he'd identified for elimination. Kenneth's surveillance network expanded dramatically as he recruited more neighbors to spy on their friends and report any activity that could be twisted into violations. He'd created a culture of informants that would have impressed totalitarian regimes, with residents competing to provide intelligence about their neighbors' activities in exchange for reduced scrutiny of their own properties. The financial fraud became increasingly sophisticated as Kenneth began intercepting mail from actual collection agencies and legal firms, replacing legitimate documents with his own fabricated versions that inflated debts and created entirely fictional legal obligations. He'd turned mail tampering into an art form, apparently unaware that federal postal crimes carry penalties that make HOA violations look like parking tickets. His technology crimes expanded beyond simple document fraud as Kenneth began accessing residents' personal information through methods that violated multiple privacy laws. He'd somehow obtained credit reports, employment information, and bank account details for families he'd targeted, using this intelligence to craft more convincing threats and time his harassment campaigns for maximum psychological impact. The intimidation tactics evolved into outright harassment as Kenneth began scheduling multiple daily inspections of targeted properties, often bringing groups of supporters to create an atmosphere of mob intimidation. These gang-like tactics were designed to make families feel unsafe in their own homes, with Kenneth orchestrating campaigns of psychological warfare that pushed far beyond any legitimate HOA authority. Kenneth's overconfidence led him to document his own crimes with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to legitimate violations. His computer files contained detailed records of every forged document, every fraudulent scheme, and every illegal tactic he'd employed. The man had essentially created a prosecutor's dream evidence package, complete with timestamps, communications records, and financial transaction details. The breaking point came when Kenneth attempted to physically intimidate elderly residents who'd questioned his authority at a recent meeting. His house calls involved implied threats about their ability to remain in their homes safely, with Kenneth suggesting that non-compliance with his demands might result in unfortunate accidents or unforeseen complications that could affect their well-being. His criminal enterprise reached its peak sophistication when Kenneth began coordinating with outside accomplices to create fake emergency situations that would justify his increasingly aggressive tactics. These manufactured crises were designed to make residents dependent on his protection, while simultaneously justifying the expanded surveillance and control measures he'd implemented throughout the neighborhood. The final straw was Kenneth's attempt to manipulate local government officials by providing them with fabricated evidence about code violations and safety hazards in homes owned by residents who'd oppose his leadership. He'd essentially tried to weaponize municipal authority to achieve his personal vendettas, crossing from HOA abuse into outright corruption of public officials. Kenneth Morrison had transformed from a petty neighborhood tyrant into a full-scale criminal mastermind, apparently believing that a string of small victories had made him invincible against any form of retaliation. What he didn't realize was that every crime he committed, every law he broke, and every boundary he crossed was being observed and documented by someone with the knowledge, resources, and connections to ensure that justice would be both swift and devastating. While Kenneth terrorized the neighborhood with his escalating criminal enterprise, I spent my evenings and weekends methodically building what would become the most comprehensive case file of HOA abuse and financial fraud ever assembled. My background in banking had taught me that the most devastating victories come not from emotional outbursts, but from patient, systematic documentation that leaves absolutely no room for denial or escape. The first phase involved establishing a timeline of Kenneth's activities using the same forensic accounting techniques we employed to investigate complex financial crimes at the bank. My position at First National Bank provided access to resources that Kenneth couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. The mortgage records for every property in Willowbrook Estates painted a fascinating picture of financial vulnerabilities that Kenneth had been systematically exploiting. More importantly, these records revealed the true ownership structure of our neighborhood and the incredible irony that would soon become Kenneth's downfall. The digital forensics component was particularly satisfying, as Kenneth's computer crimes had left electronic fingerprints throughout multiple systems that he'd accessed illegally. Working with our bank's cybersecurity team, ostensibly to investigate potential fraud affecting our mortgage customers, we uncovered a digital paper trail that documented every unauthorized access, every privacy violation, and every instance of identity theft that Kenneth had committed. Banking industry connections provided access to law enforcement resources that transformed our investigation from a neighborhood dispute into a serious criminal case. Federal agents specializing in mail fraud, wire fraud, and financial crimes began reviewing our evidence package. Though Kenneth remained blissfully unaware that his activities had attracted attention from agencies with arrest powers that extended far beyond HOA authority. The community organizing aspect required delicate handling, as Kenneth's informant network made it dangerous to openly recruit witnesses and victims. Instead, I used carefully orchestrated social situations to encourage residents to share their experiences privately, building a coalition of testimony that would demonstrate the systematic nature of Kenneth's criminal enterprise without alerting him to the investigation scope. Professional consultation with attorneys specializing in HOA law and federal criminal defense provided strategic insights that transformed our evidence from impressive documentation into legally devastating ammunition. These consultations revealed that Kenneth's activities had violated so many different laws that prosecutors would have multiple charging options, from state-level fraud to federal racketeering violations. The financial analysis component leveraged my banking expertise to trace the flow of money through Kenneth's various schemes, revealing the full scope of his embezzlement and fraud. His shell companies, fake legal fees, and manufactured penalties had generated substantial revenue that he'd been systematically stealing from the association and its members. The financial damages alone would justify serious criminal penalties. Video evidence collection required sophisticated surveillance techniques that documented Kenneth's harassment campaigns without violating privacy laws ourselves. Security cameras, dashboard recordings, and carefully documented interactions provided visual proof of his intimidation tactics, threats, and harassment that would be compelling evidence in both criminal and civil proceedings. The mortgage irregularities investigation revealed Kenneth's most devastating vulnerability. His own financial situation was far more precarious than his confident demeanor suggested. His aggressive tactics were partially motivated by personal financial desperation, and his own mortgage situation contained irregularities that could be addressed through proper banking channels with swift and devastating consequences. Expert witness preparation involved recruiting professionals who could explain the technical aspects of Kenneth's crimes to judges and juries who might not immediately understand the sophisticated nature of his fraud schemes. Banking experts, forensic accountants, and technology specialists were prepared to testify about the systematic nature of Kenneth's criminal enterprise and the substantial damages he'd inflicted. The psychological evaluation component involved documenting the emotional and mental health impacts of Kenneth's harassment campaigns on vulnerable residents, particularly elderly neighbors who'd been targeted for their perceived weakness. Mental health professionals provided expert analysis of the psychological warfare tactics Kenneth employed and their devastating effects on his victims. Legal strategy coordination ensured that our evidence package would support both criminal prosecution and civil litigation, maximizing Kenneth's exposure to consequences while providing remedies for his victims. The legal framework we developed would not only stop Kenneth's current activities, but ensure he could never again hold positions of authority over others' housing situations. The final component involved preparing for Kenneth's inevitable counterattacks once he realized the scope of the investigation. His desperate attempts to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and manipulate the legal system would only add additional charges to his already overwhelming legal problems. Every move he made to escape consequences would only dig his hole deeper. Kenneth Morrison had spent months building what he thought was an impregnable empire of intimidation and fraud. What he'd actually constructed was the most meticulously documented criminal enterprise in HOA history, complete with evidence that would ensure his prosecution, conviction, and permanent removal from any position where he could harm others. The patient predator had become the perfect prey. The monthly HOA meeting on a crisp October evening became the stage for Kenneth's spectacular downfall. Though he entered the community center with his usual swagger, completely unaware that he was walking into the most devastating public humiliation of his life. The meeting room was packed with an unusually large crowd. Residents who'd received mysterious invitations suggesting they might want to attend this particular gathering for reasons that would soon become clear. Kenneth opened the meeting with his typical authoritarian tone, rattling off a list of new violations and penalties he'd issued during the previous month. His confidence was at an all-time high as he announced his latest revenue-generating scheme, a special assessment that would require every homeowner to pay an additional $500 for enhanced security measures that coincidentally matched the cost of his new surveillance equipment. The first crack in Kenneth's composure appeared when I politely requested permission to address the association about financial irregularities I'd discovered while reviewing our HOA documents. Kenneth's face tightened with annoyance, but parliamentary procedure required him to recognize my request. He'd built his authority on strict adherence to rules and procedures, never imagining those same rules could be used against him. My presentation began innocently enough with a simple question about the association's financial statements, which Kenneth had been producing monthly with impressive detail. However, my banking background had revealed discrepancies that painted a fascinating picture of systematic embezzlement disguised as legitimate expenses. Each fabricated invoice, each inflated contractor bill, and each mysterious administrative fee was methodically exposed with supporting documentation. The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically as I displayed enlarged copies of Kenneth's forged legal documents side by side, with authentic versions from the actual law firms he'd been impersonating. The differences were obvious once highlighted: different fonts, inconsistent formatting, and legal language that no actual attorney would use. Kenneth's face went from annoyance to concern as he realized the scope of what was being revealed. The digital evidence presentation was particularly devastating, as Kenneth's computer crimes had left electronic fingerprints that proved his unauthorized access to residents' personal information. Bank records, credit reports, and employment data that Kenneth couldn't possibly have obtained legally were displayed alongside timestamps showing exactly when he'd accessed systems he had no authority to use. Kenneth's attempts to interrupt and regain control of the meeting only made his situation worse, as his increasingly desperate objections were met with additional evidence that addressed each of his denials. His claim that the documents were fake was countered with expert analysis from forensic specialists. His assertion that he had legal authority for his actions was demolished with citations from actual HOA law and federal statutes he'd violated. The financial fraud component revealed the true scope of Kenneth's criminal enterprise, with detailed accounting that showed how he'd systematically stolen thousands of dollars through fabricated expenses, inflated contractor bills, and entirely fictional legal fees. The shell companies he'd created to launder association funds were exposed with corporate registration documents that traced directly back to his personal accounts. The mail fraud evidence was particularly compelling, as postal inspectors had been investigating Kenneth's illegal interception and alteration of residents' mail for several weeks. Video surveillance from post office security cameras showed Kenneth accessing other residents' mail, while handwriting analysis confirmed his involvement in creating fraudulent legal documents that he'd been mailing to intimidate his neighbors. Kenneth's surveillance network was exposed with recordings of his conversations with neighborhood informants, revealing the extent of his illegal spying operation and the methods he'd used to manipulate residents into betraying their neighbors' privacy. The psychological manipulation tactics were laid bare with transcripts that showed his systematic approach to creating fear and paranoia throughout the community. The moment of ultimate revelation came when I announced my position at First National Bank and explained the delicious irony that Kenneth had been targeting someone with the authority to review every mortgage in the neighborhood. His face went completely white as the implications sank in. The quiet neighbor he'd been bullying had access to financial information that could destroy him with a single phone call. The criminal referral announcement was the final nail in Kenneth's coffin, as federal agents entered the meeting room to serve him with a warrant for his arrest on multiple felony charges, including mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and racketeering. Kenneth's empire of intimidation collapsed in real time as he was read his rights in front of the entire neighborhood he'd terrorized for years. Kenneth's desperate attempts to maintain his authority, even while being handcuffed, provided the perfect ending to his public humiliation. His demands that residents respect his position as HOA president were met with laughter from an audience that had just watched his criminal enterprise exposed in devastating detail. The man who'd ruled through fear was reduced to a pathetic figure begging for respect he'd never earned. The aftermath was swift and decisive, as residents who'd been terrorized by Kenneth's harassment campaigns lined up to provide additional testimony about crimes that hadn't been covered in the main presentation. Kenneth Morrison's reign of terror was over, but his legal troubles were just beginning as federal prosecutors prepared to make an example of HOA abuse that would serve as a warning to petty tyrants everywhere. The federal investigation that followed Kenneth's arrest moved with the relentless efficiency that only comes when prosecutors have overwhelming evidence and unlimited motivation to make an example of particularly egregious criminal behavior. Kenneth's systematic fraud, harassment, and intimidation had created the perfect storm of federal violations that would ensure his punishment matched the scope of his crimes against the entire community. Kenneth's first shock came when federal agents executed search warrants on his home, discovering a sophisticated criminal operation that exceeded even our most detailed expectations. His spare bedroom, HOA headquarters, contained evidence of crimes spanning multiple years, with filing cabinets full of forged documents, computer equipment loaded with stolen personal information, and detailed plans for expanding his fraudulent schemes to other neighborhoods in the area. The Financial Crimes Unit's analysis revealed that Kenneth had stolen over $200,000 through his various schemes, with the money flowing through a network of shell companies and fake accounts that demonstrated sophisticated planning and criminal intent. His embezzlement had been systematic and ongoing, with some fraudulent transactions dating back to his first month as HOA president 3 years earlier. Kenneth's attempts to hire expensive criminal defense attorneys were complicated by the fact that his stolen funds had been frozen by federal asset forfeiture proceedings, leaving him dependent on overworked public defenders who were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of evidence against their client. The same meticulous documentation skills that had made Kenneth an effective HOA tyrant now provided prosecutors with an ironclad case that offered virtually no room for defense strategies. The mortgage consequences were particularly devastating, as Kenneth's own financial situation crumbled under the weight of his legal expenses and frozen assets. His house, the base of operations for his criminal empire, went into foreclosure as his mortgage payments stopped and his credit rating collapsed under the burden of federal criminal charges and civil lawsuits from his victims. Media coverage transformed Kenneth from a neighborhood nuisance into a regional symbol of HOA abuse, with local television stations running detailed exposés about his systematic harassment campaigns and sophisticated fraud schemes. The story captured national attention as housing advocates used Kenneth's case to highlight the dangers of unchecked HOA authority and a need for stronger legal protections for homeowners. Civil litigation began immediately as residents filed lawsuits seeking damages for Kenneth's harassment, fraud, and invasion of privacy. The class action suit alone sought millions in damages, while individual lawsuits addressed specific instances of harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Kenneth's future earning potential would be consumed by legal judgments for decades to come. Professional consequences extended beyond criminal penalties as Kenneth's day job at a local accounting firm ended with his termination and the loss of his professional certifications. His criminal convictions would prevent him from ever again holding positions that involve financial responsibility or authority over others' housing situations, effectively ending any career prospects that might have helped him rebuild his life. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed disturbing patterns of narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial behavior that suggested Kenneth's HOA activities were part of a broader pattern of manipulative and controlling behavior. The court-ordered mental health treatment would be mandatory for years, with regular evaluations to assess his potential danger to future communities. Kenneth's informant network collapsed as former allies rushed to distance themselves from his criminal enterprise, with several neighbors providing additional testimony about his harassment campaigns in exchange for immunity from potential conspiracy charges. The social isolation was complete as Kenneth discovered that fear-based loyalty evaporates instantly when the source of fear loses power. Federal sentencing guidelines ensured that Kenneth would serve substantial prison time, with prosecutors recommending enhanced penalties due to the sophisticated nature of his fraud schemes and the vulnerable nature of many of his victims. Elderly residents who'd been targeted for harassment provided compelling victim impact statements that highlighted the emotional trauma Kenneth had inflicted through his systematic campaigns of intimidation. Asset forfeiture proceedings stripped Kenneth of everything he'd gained through his criminal activities, with his house, cars, and personal property seized to provide restitution for his victims. The man who'd spent years accumulating power and wealth through fraud would leave prison with nothing but the clothes on his back and a criminal record that would follow him forever. The restitution requirements meant that Kenneth would be paying his victims for decades after his release from prison, with garnishment of any future earnings ensuring that he could never escape the financial consequences of his crimes. The same aggressive collection tactics he'd used against innocent neighbors would now be turned against him by the federal court system. Kenneth's attempt to appeal his convictions was doomed from the start, as appellate courts rarely overturn cases with such overwhelming evidence and clear criminal intent. His legal team's strategy of claiming he was simply an overzealous volunteer was destroyed by evidence of his sophisticated fraud schemes and systematic criminal behavior that extended far beyond legitimate HOA activities. Kenneth Morrison had built his empire on the systematic exploitation and intimidation of his neighbors, never realizing that his careful documentation and meticulous planning would become the instruments of his own destruction. The man who'd terrorized an entire community would spend years in federal prison, followed by decades of financial obligation to the very people he'd victimized through his criminal enterprise. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates following Kenneth's imprisonment was nothing short of miraculous, as residents who'd lived under his reign of terror for years suddenly rediscovered what it meant to enjoy their homes without constant fear of arbitrary harassment and financial exploitation. The community center that had been the site of Kenneth's public humiliation became the headquarters for a resident-led renaissance that proved neighborhoods could thrive without tyrannical oversight. The new HOA leadership emerged naturally from residents who'd been silenced during Kenneth's regime, with a management structure based on transparency, fairness, and actual service to homeowners rather than exploitation of their vulnerabilities. The elaborate surveillance system Kenneth had installed was dismantled immediately, replaced with simple security measures that protected residents' privacy while maintaining reasonable safety standards for the community. Financial recovery proceeded smoothly as federal restitution payments began flowing back to Kenneth's victims, while the association's treasury was rebuilt through legitimate means rather than fabricated penalties and fraudulent fees. The detailed financial forensics that had exposed Kenneth's crimes provided a roadmap for establishing proper accounting procedures that would prevent future abuse while maintaining necessary community services. Property values throughout the neighborhood increased dramatically as word spread that Willowbrook Estates had eliminated its HOA problems permanently, attracting home buyers who'd been avoiding communities with overly aggressive association management. The negative publicity from Kenneth's criminal trial was quickly overshadowed by positive coverage of the community's successful recovery and reform efforts. Social healing required more time, but proceeded steadily as Kenneth's former informants apologized for their roles in his surveillance network, and residents learned to trust their neighbors again after years of suspicion and paranoia. Community events that had been impossible during Kenneth's regime returned with enthusiasm, rebuilding the social connections that make neighborhoods more than just collections of individual houses. Legal reforms inspired by Kenneth's case began appearing in state legislatures as lawmakers recognized the need for stronger protections against HOA abuse and clearer penalties for association officials who exceed their authority. Kenneth Morrison's criminal enterprise had inadvertently sparked a nationwide conversation about the balance between community standards and individual rights in residential associations. The personal satisfaction I experienced watching Kenneth's empire crumble was enhanced by the knowledge that his downfall had protected countless future victims from similar abuse. Banking industry colleagues who'd followed the case with fascination often remarked that it was one of the most perfect examples of patient investigation and strategic prosecution they'd ever witnessed in their careers. My own role in Kenneth's destruction remained largely private, though close neighbors understood that my banking background had been instrumental in building the case that ended his criminal career. The quiet competence that Kenneth had mistaken for weakness proved to be exactly the skill set needed to document complex financial crimes and coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies. Community recognition took the form of genuine gratitude rather than public celebration, as residents appreciated that Kenneth's removal had been accomplished through proper legal channels rather than vigilante justice. The methodical approach that had characterized the investigation continued to guide the neighborhood's recovery, ensuring that reforms were sustainable and effective rather than emotional and temporary. Professional development opportunities emerged from the case as federal agencies began consulting with banking professionals about techniques for investigating HOA fraud and financial crimes in residential communities. The expertise I developed in forensic accounting and community investigation became valuable resources for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases across the country. The final irony was revealed when Kenneth's foreclosed house was purchased by a young family who'd been specifically attracted to Willowbrook Estates because of its reputation for having solved its HOA problems permanently. The property that had been the headquarters for Kenneth's criminal empire became a symbol of the community's successful transformation and commitment to reasonable governance. Kenneth's former office was converted into a children's playroom by the new owners, with the surveillance monitors replaced by toy boxes and the filing cabinets full of violation records replaced with bookshelves loaded with children's stories. The room that had been the nerve center for neighborhood intimidation became a space for innocent laughter and family joy. Educational outreach efforts began reaching other communities struggling with HOA abuse, as residents shared their experience and investigative techniques that had proved successful in documenting and prosecuting systematic association fraud. Kenneth Morrison's criminal enterprise had inadvertently created a roadmap that other communities could follow to address similar problems with their own associations. The lasting lesson from Kenneth's downfall was that patient documentation and proper legal procedures would always defeat aggressive bullying and criminal intimidation, no matter how sophisticated the fraud schemes or extensive the harassment campaigns. Communities didn't need to tolerate abuse from association officials who forgot that they were supposed to serve residents rather than exploit them for personal gain and power. 5 years after Kenneth Morrison's arrest and conviction, Willowbrook Estates had become a model community that housing advocates frequently cited as proof that neighborhoods could thrive without sacrificing residents' rights to overly aggressive association management. The systematic reforms implemented after Kenneth's removal had created sustainable governance structures that protected homeowners while maintaining reasonable community standards through transparency and fairness rather than fear and intimidation. Kenneth himself remained in federal prison, serving a 12-year sentence that reflected the serious nature of his systematic fraud and harassment campaigns. Prison reports indicated that his adjustment to incarceration had been difficult, as his controlling personality and inability to accept responsibility for his crimes had created conflicts with both inmates and correction staff who weren't impressed by his former status as an HOA president. The restitution payments continued flowing to Kenneth's victims through garnishment of his prison wages and seizure of any assets he attempted to acquire, ensuring that he would never escape the financial consequences of his criminal enterprise. Federal monitoring would continue for years after his eventual release, preventing him from ever again holding positions of authority over other people's housing or financial situations. Community leadership had evolved into a collaborative model that engaged residents in decision-making processes rather than imposing arbitrary rules and penalties designed to generate revenue through manufactured violations. Monthly meetings featured open discussions about community needs and transparent financial reporting that prevented the kind of systematic embezzlement that had funded Kenneth's criminal activities for years. Educational initiatives reached beyond Willowbrook Estates as residents shared their experience with other communities facing similar HOA abuse, providing practical guidance about documentation techniques, legal resources, and investigative strategies that could expose and eliminate association corruption. Kenneth's case had become a cautionary tale that helped prevent similar abuse in dozens of other neighborhoods. Legal precedents established through Kenneth's prosecution strengthened federal enforcement tools against HOA fraud while providing clearer guidelines about the boundaries of association authority and the criminal penalties for officials who exceeded their legitimate powers. Law enforcement agencies now had better resources for investigating complex association crimes and supporting communities victimized by systematic harassment and financial exploitation. Personal reflection on the entire experience confirmed that patience and systematic documentation would always be more effective than emotional confrontation when dealing with institutional abuse and criminal behavior. The banking skills that had initially seemed unrelated to neighborhood disputes proved perfectly suited for investigating sophisticated fraud schemes and building cases that could withstand rigorous legal scrutiny. Professional development continued as federal agencies and legal organizations sought consultation about techniques for investigating association crimes and supporting communities recovering from systematic abuse. The expertise developed through Kenneth's case had become valuable resources for law enforcement professionals and housing advocates working to protect homeowners' rights nationwide. The mortgage industry had taken note of the case as well, with lending institutions implementing new procedures for monitoring HOA activities that might affect property values or borrower stability. Kenneth's systematic harassment and fraudulent foreclosure attempts had highlighted vulnerabilities in the relationship between association management and mortgage security that required stronger oversight and protection mechanisms. Technology improvements had enhanced community security through legitimate means that protected residents' privacy while maintaining reasonable safety standards, replacing Kenneth's invasive surveillance network with transparent systems that served actual security purposes rather than intimidation and control. The contrast between legitimate community protection and criminal spying was now clearly understood and carefully maintained. Social recovery had been complete as residents rebuilt trust and friendship networks that had been damaged by Kenneth's systematic campaigns to turn neighbors against each other through manipulation and fear. Community events flourished in an atmosphere of genuine cooperation rather than the suspicious paranoia that had characterized Kenneth's regime of informants and surveillance. The final vindication came through property values that had increased substantially above regional averages, as Willowbrook Estate's reputation for having solved its governance problems attracted homebuyers seeking communities with transparent management and reasonable oversight. Kenneth's criminal enterprise had inadvertently created marketing advantages that benefited every resident through increased equity and community desirability. Kenneth Morrison's story had become a nationwide cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of holding community leaders accountable for their actions through proper legal channels rather than accepting abuse as an inevitable part of association living. His systematic criminal enterprise had ultimately strengthened protections for homeowners everywhere by demonstrating both the scope of potential abuse and the effectiveness of patient investigation and proper prosecution. The quiet neighbor who Kenneth had underestimated and systematically harassed had proved that knowledge, patience, and access to proper resources could defeat even sophisticated criminal enterprises built on intimidation and fraud. Sometimes the most devastating revenge comes not from emotional outbursts, but from methodical justice delivered through proper legal channels by people who understand that lasting victories require permanent solutions rather than temporary satisfaction. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of property rights, neighborly conflict, and the strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a determined individual.